Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of Building Blocks. Last time around, we talked extensively about a challenged office sector and some of the things or the tools that we're using within our portfolio to help address some of the concerns that we have and to compete in a highly competitive market. One of those tools is a model suite, and I'm standing in one here today. We thought it'd be interesting to give you a little walk around and share some of the imagery as to what it looks like. This one was just recently built out, and we're excited to continue down this path and come for a walk. Now we're going to get started today by mixing things up a little bit. I'm joined by Wendy Waters, who leads our research function out of Vancouver for Realty Advisors. Welcome, Wendy, to Toronto and to the set of Building Blocks.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. Great to be here.
We thought it'd be an awesome time to bring Wendy in to pick her brain, given recent events on both sides of the border, including elections on both sides of the border. And so we'd kick things off right there. Let's start on our side of the border, Wendy. We recently went to the polls as Canadians, and we re-elected a minority liberal government, albeit one with a new leader at the helm. How do you think, I should say more pointedly, the governing style will be different from Mr. Carney versus Mr. Trudeau?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think the biggest difference is just their backgrounds. Mark Carney obviously was the governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, was also in the private sector. So comes to Canada and comes to this role with a much more technocratic background. He's interested in numbers. He's interested in how the economy works. And so I think we're going to see a governing style that starts from that knowledge base that he has, which is wanting to start from that and see changes happening. So remaking Canada's economy, strengthening Canada's economy, that's where he's coming from. There certainly will be challenges for him in that, but I think that's the big difference, is that focused on sort of economic policy ideals and maybe a little bit different from other kinds of policies that were of interest in the previous Trudeau administrations.
So he's not a political outsider, but he's not a politician exactly either. How does that shape things?
Well, I think something I'm going to be watching for is how well he navigates politics versus policy. We know he can probably do very good economic policy and even housing policy and other topics that we're interested in. But there's also the politics side. And politicians want to get reelected. They want to keep their jobs. And so sometimes what's good politically, what helps you get reelected, isn't always the most sound economic policy. Housing's a great example where local neighbors might not want new housing in their neighborhood, that's so-called NIMBYs, but in fact, adding more housing is exactly what we need to do. So I think that's something to watch for, is policy versus politics.
Can we be cautiously optimistic that this Prime Minister is going to be more focused on the economy, given his background, than his predecessor?
Definitely. I think he's going to be focused on, what's happening globally, global capital flows, how they're affecting Canada, what, can be done in Canada to, affect economic growth, and maybe what's outside of our control. So I think definitely there'll be a much more of a economic, and I'm calling it technocratic focus on numbers. That's what I'm expecting. I guess we date stamped this. A cabinet was sworn in about half an hour ago. I haven't read mandate letters, but I suspect they are going to get very precise mandate letters of what the objectives are. He said free trade in Canada by July the 1st. That's quite a challenge. So it'll be interesting to see if they're able to achieve that or how close they get.
And we were talking off camera about the new cabinet and one new cabinet minister in particular with a focus on housing.
Yeah, it's intriguing to me. Gregor Robertson, former mayor of Vancouver from 2008 to 2018, is the new housing minister. I think that's a good choice because ultimately housing decisions and how we get more housing that Canada needs, those decisions happen at City Hall, they happen in the planning departments and with city councils. So to unlock housing in Canada is going to mean unlocking activities and speeding things up at municipal halls and in municipal governments. Having someone that's run a big Canadian city as a mayor, I think is a good choice in that he knows how that works. Anyone else would come in kind of blind to the workings of the inner workings of a city hall. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Let's stay on housing, but come at it from a slightly different angle. immigration policy. Prior to his resignation, Justin Trudeau's Liberal government put a pause on what was the fastest growing level of population growth that we've ever seen in Canada. Um, how do you see immigration policy shifting with the new government, and how ultimately that might impact the supply-demand dynamic for rental housing in particular?
Yeah, so the new government, as I said, Carney and that government is going to be driven by numbers, and the numbers tell us we actually need more people in Canada. There's baby boomers retiring. And back in the 80s, there was 7 working Canadians for every retiree. Today, there's 3.5, and that number is falling and will keep falling unless we add what CIBC World Markets, their research team has said about 500,000 a year. But right now, we're not adding that. They've rolled that policy back. It was probably a good idea just to correct some problems within it. The spirit of it was good, bringing in a lot of potential new Canadians as students, getting them Canadian degrees so they would be able to fit right into the Canadian economy. That was working. There started to be some abuses around the edges of colleges starting up that weren't really offering that experience, and that's being rolled back. We still need a lot of temporary workers in our workforce to make up for some gaps, but with the softening economy, this is a good time to maybe roll back, make sure we're bringing in the right people, we've got the right structures for them to succeed so Canada succeeds. So, over the long term, I think we're going to see slightly higher immigration levels than we have now, but below what we saw coming out of COVID. So in that 500,000 range.
Edge with immigration,
I think that,
targeting different occupations and skill sets that will ultimately help build some of. I'm trying to tie this back to the rental housing
housing.
conversation. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly like Canada's short of rental housing. In the research team, we estimate the Canadian shortage of rental apartments is about 1.5 million. We're short. That's disproportionately in places like Toronto and Vancouver. Some other cities have been building what they need. But what it means is there's a long tailwind. We've got to build for the 1.5 million of excess demand that's there from people that are in overcrowded housing or adults living with their parents. That's what's there. And then if we're going to be adding 300,000, 500,000, 600,000 a year in the future of new people to Canada, we're going to need housing for those. So there's a very large tailwind for housing, which is fantastic. A need for housing at all ends of the income spectrum. So mid-market housing, which we do a lot of in the seg funds, brand new housing, which we're adding to. And the great thing about adding new housing is it allows for a flow of people out of some of the older product, which tends to be cheaper, into newer product, because we do know that somewhere around 25% of households in places like Toronto and Vancouver are earning over $100,000 a year, so they could afford to move into some of the new product and vacate it when we create it.
And to open up some inventory to help the affordability element.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what's great about the seg funds is we're offering that affordability mid-market, and then we're adding new, which creates flow. So it's exciting times.
Okay, let's shift focus down south of the border. I'm sure all of us are at this point exhausted by hearing about the threat of tariffs, and certainly things could be changing as we're speaking. I know we talk about date stamping this video. We may as well time stamp it as well to make sure that people know the exact time in which we filmed this. To the extent that trade relations remain unsettled for an extended period of time, how do you view that impacting real estate sectors or a sector in specific looking ahead?
Yeah. Well, certainly Trump has created a lot of uncertainty. I think that's the word to describe the world that he's created. And when we think about real estate strategy in times of uncertainty, we look for, well, what can we count on? We can count on that people need homes, so rental housing. So that's really a good, resilient piece of a portfolio. And people need to eat. Grocery anchored shopping centers have been a really important part of the seg funds for years, and they've proven to be really good performers in both up and down markets. And so in times of uncertainty, we know people will eat.
You must have watched our last episode. We talked about that.
Oh, yeah, you did. We talked about grocery anchored shopping centers. And then the other piece is industrial, where I think that there's going to be some changes. So there's going to be some places where there's going to be more demand for industrial. If Canada's going to trade more with non-US partners, that's going to have to happen by ship. And so that's going to be the Port of Montreal and the Port of Vancouver is going to be where a lot of goods are going to need to come and go from. So I think even more demand for industrial, which we've already had some growth in demand over the last few years. So there's probably another tailwind in certain industrial assets and certain nodes in those two markets as well.
And we have the ability to create new relationships outside of the existing ones with the United States. We've spoken extensively with our development team to talk about the impact on construction costs, as an example, to build a building, and the impact of what a full 25% tariff would mean. And really, as it boils down to it, at the end, we're talking about a 2 to 5% increase in the overall cost of a project by being able to shift gears and move to other locations, and source product from other vendors. So.
Yeah, exactly. There's an opportunity there to try out different, different products, different markets. So yeah, there's a huge opportunity on the industrial side to support the housing construction industry.
Wendy, thank you for your insights. They were excellent, as always. I have one last question for you, and it may be the hardest one of the day. For those who want to read more of the great work that you and your team put together, where will they go and find it?
It's actually a really easy question. You can go to gwlra.com and click on research. And they can also go to LinkedIn, and I try to post a couple times a week, often a chart and some analysis along similar themes to what we talked about today.
Excellent. Thanks again. Before we leave, I thought I would share a couple of brief fund updates. First, the Bank of Canada made a couple of additional cuts to the overnight rate. And while it's been choppy, bond yields have been moving lower since the beginning of the year. What this has meant is the fund has experienced a negative mark-to-market on its debt. Well, that's negative in the short term. Over the longer term, a lower cost of capital will ultimately be constructive for performance, which was modestly positive, for the fund in Q1. And next, the fund sold a couple of assets in the first quarter, continuing its rotation out of non-core suburban office and older generation industrial assets, while focusing squarely on its development opportunities and reinvestment of capital into core holdings. That's all for today. We thank you for joining us. And as always, we welcome your feedback. See you next time. Bye for now.